Okay, so this is a review of the movie Beautiful Boy. It's a 2018 film, but I'm reviewing it in 2023, and that probably changes the complexion of how I view this movie. There's some updates on, the drug crisis and the amphetamine crisis that have happened in the intervening years. So I thought I would give an updated review of this movie and what I think of it. All right, so this is the first review that I've done, by the way. So it probably won't be a really stellar movie review, and I'm not a movie critic. But there are a few personal reasons why I wanted to review this movie, which are many, and those will become apparent as I talk about the film. Now, it's a really well acted film, and I think that's my main strength of the movie that I want to talk about. Steve Carell gives a really compelling performance. He's a very charismatic lead to watch, and the movie is mostly told from his perspective. Timothée Chalamet also has some really great highlights of his performance. In some ways, he's a little bit too wonderful, a little bit too charismatic to watch, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And by the way, huge spoiler warning. This isn't the kind of movie that really has a lot of spoilers to it, so I don't know that that's really going to be relevant to anyone. The movie is about the descent of this kid into drug use and how that affects the family, so I don't think there are going to be any real surprises to spoil. So, but if it is important to you to see the movie as an unbiased, sort of without spoiler perspective, this is not a good review to listen to. I want to talk a little bit about the movie as a film, and again, I'm not a movie critic. I'm just a cinephile. I like watching movies, but this is not from any kind of educated perspective. But it's a watchable film, but there aren't a lot of character arcs in it. People enter and they end the film in kind of the same way that they entered. So that's kind of tragic. There is a lot of non-linear storytelling, so there are quite a few flashbacks, and I think that does impede the movie in some ways because it kind of diminishes the arc that characters could be on. So the main thing I want to talk about is this a realistic depiction of drug use? Now, for Steve Carell's character as the father, I think that's the main focus of the film, and I think that's a pretty realistic depiction of the struggles of losing a child to drug use. And when I say losing a child, again, spoiler warning, but Timothée Chalamet's character does not die at the end. The character is still revealed to be alive, and there's kind of a post-credits crawl at the end of the movie that I think it's actually pre-credits, but there's a crawl at the end of the movie that talks about his life after the events of the film. So let's get back to the central question of, is this a realistic movie? So from the father's perspective, I think it's a compelling story. It's a fairly decent depiction. It's a realistic depiction of Steve Carell's struggles. And as an actor, Steve Carell does really, sort of carry the film, and he makes for a compelling central tenet of the movie. Now, is this a realistic depiction of drug use? That's where I think the film falters in some ways that really could have been more adequately addressed. Now, if you've lost people to drug use, or if you've seen people who deteriorate because of drug use, I think you already know this is maybe not the right movie for you to sort of understand their journey. If you haven't seen anyone who's succumbed to drug use, you can just go walk around whatever downtown of whatever city you're living in and look at people who are unhoused, because I think you're bound to see a really, really stark and very compelling situation and scenario of people who have gone downhill due to drug use. And I'm not saying that to be snarky or glib. It's a fact that a lot of people in this country have thrown a lot of their lives away due to drug use, and it really is very tragic. And in the movie, there are some moments that come through where that tragedy is depicted. But those moments are few and far between, and you really don't get a good sense of the descent of Timothée Chalamet's character as much as you could have. Now, obviously, this is a film. It's not meant to be a really realistic, gritty depiction of real life. But at the same time, I think there were some missed opportunities in the film to depict drug use in a more realistic way. I'll give you a couple of examples from the movie. First of all, there's a situation where Timothée Chalamet, the character's girlfriend, overdoses on drugs, and he has to do CPR on her. So she's in the passenger seat of his vehicle, and he does really, really shoddy CPR on her while she's passed out. And he brings her back, and then she wakes up, and as commonly happens in movies, she gives a few coughs, and she's otherwise really fine. And she tells him that she loves him, and then he calls an ambulance for her, and they take her away. Now, if you've ever done CPR, it's actually pretty uncommon that people just kind of wake up, come out of it, and give the Hollywood recovery of CPR, which is just a few coughs. It's much more ugly than that in real life. People often vomit afterwards, if they do come back at all, and that's a fairly small percentage, especially if you're the one person who found somebody who they have to do CPR on, as Timothée Chalamet's character did. And presumably they were doing drugs together, so it's more likely that he wouldn't really have the wherewithal to conduct proper CPR. And so he does a few chest compressions, gives a few, rescue breaths, and then she wakes up and coughs, and then she says, "I love you" to Timothée Chalamet's character. And that's just, not what it really looks like in real life. I've actually had the experience of seeing CPR done and doing CPR on people who have overdosed on drugs. And the reality is really quite ugly. And then there's another reality that happens after that, which is waking up days or weeks later in the hospital with a bunch of tubes inside you. And again, this is not something that I'm being glib or lighthearted or snarky about. It's really a tragedy to see that. And that kind of ugliness is really glossed over by the movie. And, I think that was a bit of a missed opportunity. Again, spoiler warning, but at the end of the film, Timothée Chalamet's character overdoses in a restaurant bathroom. Now, I actually know people that this has happened to, and I know people who have lost loved ones in exactly this manner. But what happens with Timothée Chalamet's character is they kind of skip ahead then to his recovery, where he's awake, he's fine, and he's talking to his father, and they sort of embrace. So they kind of gloss over all the ugliness of drug use. For those of you who have lost people to drug use, you already know this. But when you're using harder drugs, those drugs take away part of your personality in an incremental fashion. Now, what do I mean by that? An analogy, and again, I don't mean to give this in any kind of a humorous or lighthearted way. This is very tragic. But an analogy is people who have lost loved ones to diabetes. What happens is, the diabetes will often take, their toes, and then it'll take part of the foot, and then an amputation will be done below the leg, and then an amputation above, or below the knee, and then an amputation above the knee. So there's sort of an incremental loss of that loved one over time. And I really feel like the same thing happens with drug use. People who use a lot of drugs, especially a lot of harder drugs, it takes away parts of their brain. It does brain damage. It takes away parts of their personality. And by the way, if you've ever had someone who's come back to life after getting CPR, they often have really bad brain damage, and you can tell their personality has really changed. So it's the same thing with drug use. Those hard drugs do a lot of sort of damage to the brain over time. So the person who comes back from experiences like that is often not the same person that you watched go into that experience. So that sort of incremental loss of personality, of mental wherewithal, of intelligence, of brightness is really glossed over in the movie. And there's really no focus on that. At the end of the movie, Timothée Chalamet's character is still sort of depicting as, a loving family member, a wonderful human being who's just struggled a lot. And that may hopefully be the story for some people. Hopefully people will get to the end of their journey and will be able to come out of it with very much being the same person. But often that's not the rule to the experience that people have. Very often, Again, if you don't believe me, you can just walk around in any downtown of any major city and see people who are suffering from a lifetime of drug use. But very often, the people who come out of those experiences have really lost a lot of themselves. Timothy Chalamet's character throughout the movie is kind of depicted as a really brilliant writer. And there was indeed a book based on the memoirs of the character that he portrays in the film. I think his name is Nick Sheff. And it's apparently a really well-written memoir. But at the same time, people who use a lot of hard drugs after several years of that kind of behavior, they can barely string 3 words together to make a sentence. So it's really not quite the rosy picture that the movie paints. And then, Timothy Chalamet is also portrayed as, a very loving brother and a very loving family member. And it's likely that the character that this movie is based on was indeed a loving person. But I kind of do wish that that sort of dulled and blunted personality that people have after a lot of drug use, I kind of wish that that had been portrayed by the film, and it really wasn't in this case. There's another scene where Timothy Chalamet injects some IV drugs, and, then he has passionate, sex with his new girlfriend. And that's another depiction where I think the movie is kind of romanticized. Now, I'd like to talk about 2 other things that entail the romanticization of the character journey that Timothy Chalamet's character is on. Now, one of those is the depiction of him as a very bright, very gifted writer with a lot of potential. In some ways, I think it's a little bit dangerous to depict drug use in that setting. Why? Because I see a lot of young people who struggle with a lot of pressures and a lot of expectations because they're told that they have a lot of potential. And I think in some ways, drug use is a way of escaping those expectations and escaping the onerous burden of being told that you have a lot of potential. So I think that kind of characterization of his role in the movie as being somebody with a lot of potential is a little bit dangerous. I think it's also dangerous that they really show graphically him injecting drugs intravenously and then having really passionate sex with his partner. That's part of the journey that some people have, but it's certainly, not the right journey for a lot of people. In a lot of cases, drug use is a very isolating experience, and it's a very isolated journey. And throughout the movie, Timothy Chalamet is being shown as somebody with friends, with loved ones, with a support network, with a girlfriend. And I wish the isolation of drug use had been better depicted in the movie. There's also not a lot of consequences depicted to his drug use. At one point, you see a lot of scars on his arm, but that's really kind of the only part of the movie that really captures any damage that he's done. At the end of the movie, you really get the sense that he has emerged as a similar character. Now, by the way, as an actor, I think there are some really inspired moments of Timothy Chalamet's characterization. I think there are a few moments where he really shines and you can see that the light inside him has gone out a little bit. Those are great moments in the film. I think they could have been more clearly depicted and they could have been highlighted more by the film. That in some ways, you kind of lose your sense of the journey that he's on and his ascent because there's a lot of nonlinear storytelling. So you get a lot of flashbacks to when the character did have a brighter personality and was very charismatic and colorful. So you kind of do lose your sense because of the nonlinear storytelling that he is on a path where he's on a descent. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is that if you're thinking of bringing a family member or a loved one to see this film, then you should probably know that there are some really graphic depictions of intravenous injection. Now, that may just be me personally describing the depictions that way. I don't like IV injection. That really creeps me out. I don't like seeing needles injected into arms. I think the movie could have omitted the shots of direct intravenous injection of needles and it probably wouldn't have suffered at all in terms of the storytelling. So I'm not sure why that creative decision making was made to put those shots in. But you should know that this is not a film for the faint-hearted just because of those 2 or 3 shots of IV drug injection. I think if you're thinking about bringing a family member to this and they're young, you should make sure that they're aware that there is some IV drug use depicted really in some detail. It's not necessarily gory detail if you're used to people injecting things into their arms, but I've seen people inject drugs into their arms in real life, and it's gross to me. It's depicted in the movie. I don't think it needed to be included because it was just 3 or 4 brief shots, but it is a warning to people who are faint-hearted. Now, why did I choose to review this movie? Just as a final thought, I think drug use is really terrible. I work with people who are unhoused. I also work with people in a medical capacity, and so I've seen people really suffering. So I think it's worth sort of describing that this is not the right film to take people to if you want to dissuade them from using drugs. In some ways, like I said, the journey is romanticized. In some ways, the really huge tragedies of drug use are not really depicted in the movie. It's really not about that. If you're taking somebody to this film because you want them to see what a family member's journey is like, I think this is a good movie, and I think in some ways this is a better film for people who are suffering from the drug use of others. Steve Carell's journey is really the focus of the movie. It's a story that's really told from his perspective, and I think there are people who will see this movie who will have a sense of solace after they see the journey that he's on in this movie. They may feel a better sense of companionship. I just kind of wish that this movie had had a better depiction of the real downsides of drug use, the real tragedies, the parts of your personality that you lose from it, the parts of your mind and your brain that you lose from it, and also the isolation that happens with people who throw away their lives due to drugs. Those people are really very isolated, and that's one of the biggest tragedies of drug use, and I wish that had been a better focus. All right, so overall thoughts on the movie. It's well acted. If you're seeing it for the acting, it's a compelling film, great portrayals. The characters don't have huge character arcs, but I do think it's a well acted film. If you're seeing it to, watch a movie that is really an example of great filmmaking, I don't think it's quite there. There are some nice shots in the movie. There's some nice cinematography. There's an interview that Steve Carell has at the beginning of the movie that's sort of a framing device that comes back a couple of times in the movie. But I don't think that there's a lot of explanation into that, and I don't think the movie really comes back to that as much as it would need to explain it thoroughly. The movie does present itself as an example of why you shouldn't do drugs, and I don't think in that regard that it succeeds in making that point. Again, I think it romanticizes the character. It portrays him as a really wonderful person with a lot of potential, as a brilliant writer, as somebody who has a girlfriend, and it sort of doesn't portray the harms of drug use, the isolation, the parts of your personality that you lose from doing drugs. And I do think that at the end of the movie, it sort of gives you the conclusion that, drug use is terrible and you shouldn't do drugs. And those are correct points. I think those are really important to make. But does the movie really compel you towards those points throughout its runtime? I think the answer is no. So final thoughts on the movie. If you're interested in seeing it because you want to see Steve Carell and Timothée Chalamet, they both have really important, wonderful, compelling aspects of their performances. They're great actors, and their skills are really on display in this movie in a really wonderful way. If you're interested in the movie from a cinematic perspective and you want to see a character that really has an arc, I don't think it's really there in this movie. I don't think it's a film that I would call great. And if you're interested in trying to dissuade someone from doing drugs, I don't think this is the right movie at all, which is basically the point of why I wanted to make this review. And again, if you have small kids, this is definitely not any kind of movie that would be appropriate for youngsters or family members. I think this is a good movie for people who are watching somebody else do drugs and they want to feel that sense of empathy for a character who's living out some aspects of their journey on the screen. I haven't done a movie review yet so far. This is the first movie review I've done, and I'm not a film critic, but I guess I would give this movie, I don't know, 1.5 stars out of how many? I don't know, maybe out of 4. Again, there are some aspects of the movie that are pretty good, but there are some aspects that I think prevent it from being a great film and prevent it from being compelling towards the point that it purports to make. All right, well, thank you very much for listening to this review. What do you think? If you've seen the movie, please include your comments. I'll try to respond to each and every comment that I get, which probably will be easy because there probably won't be that many. If you've had someone that you've lost due to drug use, please put that in the comments if you feel comfortable sharing that. I'd be curious to know what your journeys are around this movie. If you haven't seen the tragedy of drug use, get involved in your community, serve the unhoused, because a lot of the downward spiral that the unhoused are having in their current crisis, and it is a global and national crisis, is due to the use of drugs that are stealing their personalities, that are robbing them from the lives that they could have. And it's probably worth saying that as somebody who's seen a lot of the tragedy around drug use myself, it's important that people, not do drugs. The hard drugs that people are doing these days are really terrible, and they're really, really catastrophically ruining people's lives and taking away parts of people's minds, parts of their personality, parts of their lives, parts of their loves. And there are a lot of tragedies that I've seen around drug use that are really horrifying. All right, well, thanks very much for listening to this review, and thank you for sharing your opinion in the comments section. And let me know if there's other movies that you'd like me to review as well. All right, thanks very much.